Have you ever watched someone so obsessed with slogans and social media that they forgot the rules holding their entire company together? What would you do if your boss cut your hours, humiliated you in front of your team, and then laughed while stripping away your benefits? Would you fight back loudly or wait in silence for the perfect moment? In my case, I chose patience. My name is Maya Turner. I am 37 years old, a compliance officer from Denver, and this is the story of how my director's arrogance triggered a countdown she never saw coming. Now I invite you to take a few minutes and listen to my story, and afterward, tell me, what would you have done in my place? My name is Maya Turner. I am 37 years old, and I work as a compliance officer at a mid-sized biotech company in Denver, Colorado. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest where hard work was a badge of honor, and my parents raised me to believe that rules were not meant to be broken, especially when they involved safety. That belief became the compass that guided me into this job, where every detail matters and one overlooked signature can mean the difference between safe innovation and dangerous disaster. It was not glamorous work, but it mattered, and for years I poured myself into making sure every license, every log, and every compliance form was airtight. I thought that dedication would protect me, but I learned very quickly that in the wrong hands, even diligence can be used against you. I will never forget the morning when Sophie Lane, my director, marched into the lab with a golden retriever wearing safety goggles. Sophie was 35, polished and charming, the kind of manager who valued appearances over substance. She called it a brand moment, a way to make science look friendly for social media. But to me, it was a violation of every principle I lived by. This was not a photo studio. This was a federally regulated environment with restricted substances. And yet there she stood, holding a pastel ring light in one hand while her dog squirmed in the other. My coworkers laughed nervously, unsure whether to object or pose. Sophie waved me over and told me to join in, to stand next to the dog and smile as if the goggles made it safe. I told her firmly that this was a lab, not a playground, and pets were not allowed inside. She looked at me with the kind of smirk that makes you feel both dismissed and targeted all at once. She did not argue with logic. She dismissed it with charm. She tilted her head, smiled sweetly, and said that I did not get it. That science was no longer just research, it was a lifestyle brand. She told me that if I did not support the brand, maybe I would not get the hours. It sounded like a joke in that moment, but the way she said it made something in my chest go cold. When I left work that night, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself she was only playing. The next morning, I learned how wrong I was. I opened my email and found an automated message waiting for me with the subject line, Schedule Adjustment Notice. My hours had been cut from 36 to 28, just enough to remove me from the threshold of full-time status. No explanation, no conversation, no acknowledgement of my years of work, just a cold system update that instantly stripped away my benefits and, more importantly, my compliance authority. It was not just a reduction in hours. It was a quiet dismissal of my role as the only authorized compliance signatory. Sophie had made her point with a smile and an email, and I knew then that the ground beneath me had shifted. When Sophie strolled by my desk later that day with her iced matcha, she leaned close enough for me to catch the faint scent of peppermint gum and told me cheerfully, "No hard feelings. Maya, it is just a vibes thing." She spoke as if she had not just jeopardized my financial security and my professional standing with one petty decision. I smiled politely, but inside I was burning. She thought she had won, that she had silenced me by shrinking my hours and reducing my importance. What she did not realize was that by cutting my hours, she had done more than strip my benefits. She had unintentionally pulled the trigger on a clause in the law that required a full-time compliance officer for license renewals. She thought she had disarmed me, but in reality, she had armed me with something far stronger than anger. The truth about compliance is that most people in a company see it as background noise, a set of boxes that check themselves, invisible until they suddenly matter. I had lived in that world for years, the only one who understood how fragile the system really was, and now Sophie had unknowingly put a crack right through the foundation. Our lab's operational license renewal was approaching, a deadline that was not decorative, not optional, but a federal requirement with legal teeth. The form needed 3 things: up-to-date documentation, current certification, and most importantly, the digital signature of a compliance officer working no fewer than 30 hours per week. By cutting my hours to 28, Sophie had disqualified me, which meant no one else in the company had the authority to legally renew. When I saw the renewal task in the system, my stomach tightened with a mix of anger and curiosity. The box that should have glowed green now blinked a faint yellow, waiting for a signature I could no longer give. I hovered over the authorization field, the software reminding me in stark letters, "Not eligible to sign. Part-time status detected." I knew that line would echo later like a warning bell, but in that moment I simply sat back and let the reality sink in. I did not fight the system. I did not try to override it, because this was not sabotage. This was policy. This was the law doing its job for me. I updated my employment status in the compliance dashboard, flagged the renewal form as pending authorization, and clicked submit. The system responded in the only language it knows, cold automation. It generated an internal notice, escalated it to HR, legal, and the executive board, then stamped the renewal with a status that read incomplete. There were no flashing alarms, no urgent calls, just a quiet warning buried in an inbox. That was the part Sophie never understood. Compliance does not scream. It whispers. And if you ignore the whispers long enough, the silence becomes deafening. I printed a copy of the flagged form, signed and dated it, and filed it in my locked desk drawer. Beside it, I placed a backup USB with every timestamp and log I had archived over the past year. It was not a weapon yet, but it was insurance. My job had always been about protecting the company from its own blind spots, but in that moment I shifted. I was no longer protecting Sophie's version of leadership. I was protecting myself. Every ignored warning, every overlooked update, every autopiloted dismissal of my work was now becoming evidence. The irony was bitter and satisfying at the same time. Sophie thought cutting my hours would weaken me, but instead she had pulled the pin on something she could not see, a silent countdown only I understood. While she played with ring lights and hashtags, I knew that when the deadline came, the renewal would collapse without my signature. And when it did, she would not be holding a brand moment. She would be holding the blame. I closed the drawer with a soft click, took a slow breath, and returned to my desk as though nothing had changed. But inside I knew everything had. It did not take long for Sophie to make her next move, and she did it with the same glossy confidence she wore like a second skin. A week after my hours were cut, an email landed in my inbox with the subject line, Culture Synergy Workshop. It sounded harmless enough, maybe even dull, but the moment I read her agenda, I knew it was something darker. She wanted to reframe compliance as a brand alignment exercise, and she had summoned the entire department to the largest conference room. I walked in that morning to the faint smell of stale donuts, the kind that always appear when bad news is about to be sugar-coated. My coworkers shuffled into their seats, uncertain, while Sophie stood at the front in a pastel blazer, her golden retriever now in a tiny hoodie labeled Chief Inspiration Officer. The lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life. The first slide was a mood board of soft colors and slogans like Science with a Smile and Innovation Through Lifestyle. The second slide made the air in the room shift. A blurry photo of me walking through the lab appeared on the screen, pulled from the security cameras, with the caption in bold red letters, Resistance to Brand Vision. She did not need to say my name, but she did anyway, almost sweetly, as if it were a game. Some people here, she sang, are struggling to embrace our culture shift. The silence that followed was heavy, and I could feel my coworkers glance at me, pity in their eyes but no one daring to speak. I kept my face neutral, though my chest burned with humiliation and anger. Sophie clicked to another slide that showed a pie chart with one wedge labeled Compliance Drag. She spoke about how compliance had become an obstacle to brand engagement, how we needed to be more agile, more playful, more aligned with her vision. The words spilled out like candy, but each one cut deeper because I knew exactly what she was doing. She was isolating me, painting me as the problem, setting the stage for something bigger. When she finally paused to sip her latte, I raised my hand calmly and asked one question. Can I have that in writing? The room went still. The projector fan hummed louder than the people. Sophie laughed, high and brittle, and shook her head. Oh, Maya, it is not like that. This is not punitive. It is a dialogue, non-linear, agile-based. We are just exploring vibes. She tossed corporate buzzwords like confetti at a parade, but her refusal told me everything. She wanted the power of accusation without the responsibility of accountability. I nodded once, my expression flat. 10 minutes later, I was back at my desk. I opened a blank document and began to type. Summary of Culture Synergy Workshop, 10 hours a.m., Conference Room 2B. I recorded who was present, the exact slide she used, the words she spoke, and the moment she projected my face under the phrase, Resistance to Brand Vision. I did not add emotion or commentary, just facts, crisp and undeniable. I saved the file, encrypted it, and emailed it to my private account. Then I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a single thought. She believed she had humiliated me, but what she had really done was hand me proof. And proof always lasts longer than vibes. After that workshop, something inside me shifted. For years, I had been the one quietly patching holes before anyone noticed them. The person who stayed late to fix the spreadsheet that no one else could untangle. The one who logged into the dashboard at 10 o'clock at night just to make sure every alert was cleared. I had always believed that diligence would protect me, that if I worked harder, I would be untouchable. But Sophie had shown me the truth. She did not want my diligence. She wanted obedience. She wanted smiles in her photos. She wanted silence when rules were bent. And if I refused to play that role, she was willing to cut my hours and paint me as a villain to get what she wanted. So I made a decision. I stopped giving her more than what was written in my job description. The change was small at first. I arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, not 8:30. I left at 5 o'clock on the dot, not 5:15, not 5:30. When a compliance alert popped up after hours, I let it sit until the next morning. When a vendor certificate expired over the weekend, I did not log in from home to update it. When Sophie sent a message on Slack asking me to hop on a quick call about mixing wellness programs with lab safety protocols, I ignored it until business hours. I was not loud about it. I was not confrontational. I simply did my job exactly as written, nothing more, nothing less. It did not take long for the cracks to show. A calibration deadline slipped by 1 day, then 2. A chemical disposal log sat unclosed for nearly a week. A vendor renewal form stayed flagged yellow on the dashboard, not urgent enough to trigger alarms, but visible enough to raise eyebrows. Before, I would have caught all of those issues before anyone else even noticed. Now I let them breathe. I wanted the system to speak in its own language, to show the truth without me translating it away. And the truth was this: compliance was never automatic. It was human, and Sophie had pushed the one human keeping it together into silence. The irony was almost poetic. Sophie walked around the office with her pastel binders and branded slogans, believing she was the visionary, the one driving the culture. But the real engine of the company was hidden in the quiet tasks no one thanked me for, the tasks that only became visible when left undone. I began documenting those, too. Every overdue entry, every unacknowledged alert, every timestamp that proved I was no longer authorized to sign. I printed them, filed them neatly, and added them to the growing folder in my locked drawer. It was not sabotage. It was evidence. People think disengagement is loud, a slammed door, a resignation email, a dramatic speech. But real disengagement is silent. It is a withdrawal of effort, a pulling back of the invisible labor that everyone takes for granted. That was what I gave Sophie: silence, precision, and patience. And in that silence, the system began to bend. She thought she had weakened me by cutting my hours. What she never understood was that she had also weakened herself. She had removed the very thing keeping her illusions afloat. And when the deadline came, the cracks would not be mine to explain. They would be hers. There is a date that every compliance officer knows by heart, and for me that date was October 1st at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was printed in bold on every compliance calendar pinned to every wall in the building. But like most bold warnings in corporate life, it had become wallpaper, something to nod at in meetings and then ignore in practice. For me, it was not decorative. It was the axis around which everything turned, the deadline that determined whether our lab was operating legally or hanging by a thread. I had always been the one to make sure that deadline was met, quietly, invisibly, like flipping a switch before the lights went out. This year, I did nothing but watch the shadow of that date grow closer each day. I made preparations in my own way, not in secret, not in sabotage, but in meticulous documentation. Every time the system generated a warning, I downloaded a copy. Every time an alert was sent to HR, legal, or the executives, I recorded the timestamp and whether it was opened, ignored, or left unread. I built a folder on my encrypted drive titled simply Proof. Inside it grew a timeline that told its own story, a story of indifference and arrogance disguised as leadership. By the time the deadline was 3 weeks away, I had dozens of files, each one undeniable, each one stronger than any speech I could ever make. Meanwhile, Sophie was not watching the clock at all. She was in marketing meetings showing off mock-ups of branded yoga mats for employees, pitching it as wellness culture meets science innovation. She posed her golden retriever for more photos, now in a tiny lab coat with the company logo stitched across the back. She posted them to the internal portal with captions like, "Balance is compliance," and people laughed nervously and clicked like, because disagreeing with Sophie was riskier than rolling your eyes in private. She was living in a world of slogans, but I was living in a world of statutes, and those statutes did not bend for vibes. The closer the deadline came, the calmer I felt. There was a strange satisfaction in watching the numbers tick down, and knowing that I did not have to lift a finger to make the system work against her. The rules were already in place, written long before Sophie ever decided to cut my hours. and those rules were now turning into the sharpest form of justice I could imagine. All I had to do was stay quiet and let time do the work. I showed up at 9, left at 5, kept my reports minimal, and each evening, I updated my proof folder with whatever new neglect had been logged that day. People think revenge requires shouting or confrontation, but what I was doing was the opposite. It was patience. It was discipline. It was a countdown that only I could hear, ticking softly beneath the noise of Sophie's slogans and pastel charts. October 1st at 8 o'clock was not just a deadline. It was an hourglass, and every grain of sand that fell brought Sophie closer to discovering that by trying to diminish me, she had signed her own destruction. The morning of October 1st arrived without fireworks, without drama, just another Monday in a building that believed deadlines were decorative. I poured my usual cup of coffee, its bitter edge sharper than usual, and sat down at my desk as if it were any other day. The compliance dashboard in front of me blinked with the same alert I had been watching for weeks. Operational license renewal incomplete. 2 green boxes, 1 red, waiting for a signature I was no longer authorized to give. At 8 o'clock on the dot, the system flipped from pending to expired. No alarms, no sirens, just a quiet line of text that carried the weight of federal law. And then, at 9:10, I heard it, Sophie's voice, shrill and panicked, echoing down the hallway. "What do you mean our license expired?" she demanded, her words ricocheting off the sterile white walls. I turned my head just enough to see a man in a navy blazer standing calmly by the lab doors. His badge gleamed with the seal of the Department of Health and Human Services, the kind of credential that makes even the boldest executive lose their confidence. In his hand, he held a black binder thick with regulations, and in his pocket, a red security seal. He spoke with a calm that only authority can bring. "According to your most recent filings, your compliance officer is listed as Maya Turner. Payroll indicates she is part-time. That makes her ineligible to sign. As of 8 a.m., your license expired. This facility is now operating illegally." Sophie tried to laugh, tried to summon the charm that had gotten her through so many boardroom battles. "This must be a mistake," she said, brushing a stray hair from her forehead, her golden retriever tugging at the leash in her hand. "I am the director here. Surely we can sort this out over coffee." The inspector did not smile. He peeled the red security seal from his case, pressed it against the biometric lab door, and with a click, the lock turned crimson. Access revoked. Federal hold. The silence that followed was louder than any alarm. Technicians shuffled out of the lab holding trays of samples, their faces pale with confusion. One whispered to another, "Does this mean we stop work?" The inspector nodded. "Effective immediately. Until resolved, all operations are suspended." I stayed at my desk, eyes on my screen, fingers resting calmly on the keyboard. Sophie spun toward me, eyes wide with fury and fear. "Maya, can you explain what's going on?" Her voice cracked on my name. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the bitter roast, and replied evenly, "You will want to check your inbox." The truth hung in the air like smoke. I had sent the memo 2 weeks earlier, documenting everything, citing the statute, attaching my pay stub that proved I was part-time. Legal had received it. HR had received it. Sophie had marked it as red. They all had the warnings. They had all ignored them. Now the inspector was standing in the hallway with the law in his binder and the lock on our doors. And I did not have to raise my voice. Not once. The system had spoken for me. The silence after the inspector sealed the lab was broken by one sound that rattled even me, the booming voice of our chief financial officer, Daniel Reed, who was 48 and usually calm to the point of being unreadable. That morning, his voice tore through the hallway like a storm. Do you have any idea what it costs every day this lab is shut down? $850,000. Every single day. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, and he looked less like an executive and more like a man watching the bottom line dissolve in real time. Around him, people were whispering, pretending not to listen but hanging on every word, the way office crowds do when they smell blood in the water. Within half an hour, the boardroom was filled with red faces and restless hands. The executives sat in their polished chairs, but there was nothing polished about the tension in that room. The general counsel flipped through a printed copy of the regulations, section by section, until he landed on the paragraph I had already memorized. He read it out loud in a voice that felt more like a verdict than a reminder. License must be renewed annually by an authorized compliance officer working no fewer than 30 hours per week. He looked up, his eyes heavy with something between anger and resignation. Who adjusted her schedule below the threshold? All eyes turned to HR, and the man sitting there, pale and sweating, cleared his throat. Adjustment number 1837. Initiated by Director Lane. The words fell heavy on the room. Sophie's face drained of color, and for the first time, she looked small, like someone who had built her world on glitter and charm only to watch it crumble under the weight of one undeniable fact. She tried to argue, waving her hands, insisting that it was just a few hours, that I was still here, still working, still capable. But the general counsel shut her down with a single shake of his head. You disqualified her. That is not a rounding error. That is federal law. I was not in the room, but I did not need to be. My phone lit up with calls from numbers labeled priority and unknown, one after another, buzzing like a hornet's nest on my desk. I let each one ring out, the screen glowing and fading, glowing and fading. I could almost hear the desperation on the other side. Finally, a text appeared from the general counsel himself. Please respond. Critical. Name your terms. I looked at it for a long moment before setting my phone face down beside my coffee. They were moving from denial to bargaining, and I had not even spoken a word. Sophie must have felt the weight pressing in on her because minutes later, another message appeared on my screen, this time from her personal account. Hey, can we talk one-on-one? Just us girls. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Paw paw. She had even added a winking emoji, as if the collapse of our entire lab could be smoothed over with a joke. I stared at it until my stomach turned, then replied with a single period. Nothing more. That was the point. For once, she would have to sit in the silence she created, the silence she never thought could bite back. I knew the calls would not stop, so I did what I had been preparing for all along. I walked 3 blocks down to a small cafe called River and Grind, a place where the hum of the espresso machine was steady and the noise of the office could not reach me. Across the table sat my closest friend and my attorney, Elise Carter, 39 years old, sharp as glass, and the kind of person who could turn corporate panic into leverage with a single sentence. She already had her laptop open, contracts glowing across the screen, and without even asking what I wanted, she slid me a lavender oat milk latte. She knew me well enough to understand that today required both comfort and clarity. Elise leaned back and said quietly, "They are desperate. This is when you decide what your silence is worth." Her words cut through the noise in my head, and I felt something I had not felt in months: control. For weeks, I had been forced into the role of bystander while Sophie chipped away at my hours and humiliated me in front of my peers. Now the balance had shifted. They needed me, and they needed me badly enough to listen. I opened the draft Elise had prepared, a reinstatement agreement written with surgical precision, every clause a boundary carved in steel. The first line was non-negotiable, 40 hours minimum per week, guaranteed, with no exceptions. The second, a promotion to Vice President of Compliance Integrity, a title that came with board-level access and a seat at the table where decisions were made. The third gave me authority to build my own independent compliance team with its own budget, free from interference. The fourth secured back pay for every hour and benefit I had lost since Sophie's adjustment, along with annual bonuses tied directly to policy updates. The fifth was whistleblower retaliation protection, a shield for the future. Elise had even added one more, the right to speak to the media without corporate filter, just in case they thought they could twist the story later. As I read through the clauses, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Priority call. I let it go. Then another. Then a text. Please talk to us. Name your conditions. We will make this right. Elise glanced at the screen and smirked. Stage 2, bargaining. They will agree to almost anything. The question is, how much do you want? I tapped my finger against the table and thought about Sophie's smirk, about the caption she had projected under my face in that conference room, about the benefits she had stripped away with one click. I looked back at Elise and said, I want them to remember this. I want them to never forget who kept the lights on. She nodded, made a small adjustment to the language, and pressed save. At 11 o'clock sharp, Elise hit send. The contract went to the General Counsel, HR, and the COO with a subject line that left no room for doubt. Reinstatement agreement. Execution required before license activation. Then I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in months, I felt the power shift back into my hands. They could keep calling, they could keep begging, but the truth was simple. Nothing would move, nothing would restart, until they agreed to every line of the terms I had set. When I finally stepped back into the boardroom that afternoon, the air was heavy enough to choke on. The long, polished table that once symbolized power now looked like a battlefield littered with fear. Sophie sat slouched in one of the far chairs, her pastel hoodie wrinkled, her eyes hollow, as if she had aged years in a single morning. The executives barely acknowledged her. Their focus was on me, and more importantly, on the single sheet of paper I carried in my hand. It was not flashy, it was not long, but it weighed more than all of Sophie's slogans combined. It carried the terms of my return. I walked to the head of the table, placed the document in front of the General Counsel, and said simply, "These are my conditions." He did not argue, did not stall. He pulled out his pen and began to read line by line as though his future depended on it. And maybe it did. 40 guaranteed hours. Vice President title. Independent compliance team. Retroactive compensation with bonuses indexed to policy. Whistleblower protections. Non-interference from suspended executives. Each clause landed like a hammer. I watched the color drain further from Sophie's face when her name was referenced directly in that last clause. She opened her mouth to protest, but before a sound left her lips, the COO cut her off coldly. "You are suspended pending review. Do not speak." The HR director, who had been scribbling nervously on a notepad, looked at me with wide eyes as I handed over my old badge. "New one, please," I said calmly. "This one is expired." His hands shook as he accepted it, nodding without a word. When the general counsel reached the bottom of the page, he signed with a flourish that felt almost like relief and pushed it back toward me. "Welcome back, Vice President Turner." For the first time, the title felt like more than words. It was armor, and it was mine. I opened my laptop right there in front of them. The compliance dashboard glowed red, the renewal form blinking with the same incomplete warning it had carried for weeks. With steady hands, I entered my new credentials, authenticated with the updated clearance, and signed. The dashboard shifted from red to green, clean and alive again. The COO leaned forward, desperation leaking through his professional tone. "How long until operations resume?" I looked him in the eye. Immediately. "The inspector has been waiting for confirmation." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a message. "Received confirmation. Lock removed. Access re-enabled." I turned the screen so the entire room could see. The relief in the room was palpable, but it was not for Sophie. She slumped deeper into her chair, whispering a hollow, "Thank God." The general counsel, without lifting his eyes from the papers in front of him, muttered, "Not for you." And in that moment, the power she once wielded with hashtags and hollow speeches evaporated. I had not shouted. I had not fought in public. I had put my terms on paper and let the law do the rest. And paper, when used with precision, is the sharpest weapon of all. Downstairs, the red seal was peeled from the lab doors. The inspector clipped it off like a lock lifted from a cage, and the technicians filed back inside with cautious relief. Machines hummed to life again, lights blinked back to steady green, and the work resumed as though nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had changed. Sophie stormed toward the lab entrance, badge in hand, her ponytail snapping behind her like a banner of desperation. She swiped once. Red light. She swiped again, harder. Red light. Her badge had been deactivated. Security approached quietly, one officer on each side, and the COO's voice carried across the room with the weight of finality. "Escort her to collect her things." She turned to me then, wide-eyed, her face a mixture of fury and panic. "Maya, please, you cannot let them do this to me." But I did not answer. I had no reason to. For months she had mocked me, dismissed me, stripped my hours, and painted me as the problem. She believed compliance was decoration, that my work was background noise. Now she was learning what happens when the quiet part is withdrawn. The lab did not crumble because I sabotaged it. It crumbled because she ignored the scaffolding that had held it up all along. I walked past her, my new badge cool and heavy against my blazer, and I never once looked back. In the days that followed, the company scrambled to rewrite its narrative. Press releases were drafted, stakeholders reassured, and investors promised that operations were back to normal. Behind those carefully polished words, I built my new compliance team, one I chose personally, one that answered to me and the board alone. No pastel slogans, no dogs in goggles, just professionals who understood that the rules were not barriers, but safeguards. For the first time in years, I felt respected not for my silence, but for my authority. And it was not Sophie's brand that restored trust. It was my paper trail. Sometimes people imagine revenge as a loud spectacle, a dramatic showdown, or a moment of public shaming. What I learned is that true revenge can be quiet. It can be a time-stamped memo, an unopened email, a regulation clause patiently waiting for its turn to matter. I did not raise my voice. I did not fight in the way Sophie expected. I documented, I waited, and I let time do what it always does. It exposes arrogance and rewards patience. So if there is a lesson in my story, it is this: never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who keep the lights on while others play with slogans. Because when you push them aside, when you strip away their authority and laugh at their warnings, you are not just insulting them. You are dismantling the very system that protects you. Sophie learned that the hard way, and I walked out stronger, not because I shouted, but because I never needed to. Revenge does not always roar. Sometimes it just waits until the clock runs out. In the end, Sophie lost her power, her badge, and her voice. I gained a new title, a stronger team, and the kind of respect she never understood. Not because I shouted, but because I trusted the rules she ignored. Revenge does not always come with fire and fury. Sometimes it is patient, quiet, and written on paper. What do you think? Was I too silent, or was this the only way to win? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe in justice served cold, follow our channel Revenge Vault for more stories just like this.